Welcome everybody to Gazzelli Art House for our talk this evening, which is going to be a discussion about the work and legacy of Harold Cohen. The talk coincides with our current exhibition, Refactoring, which focuses on works made between 1966 and 1974. The show investigates Cohen's practice in the years preceding and inaugural to his creation of Aaron, the preeminent computer program designed to create art autonomously. This exhibition also coincides with the first major posthumous museum show of Harold Cohen and Aaron's work at the Whitney Museum of American Art, which ends on the 19th of May. So if you've got a couple of days to fly to New York and go and see that. We're very grateful to all three speakers who are joining us tonight, who have each contributed a text to our recent publication, which is also now available to buy. But without further ado, please welcome Melanie Lenz is the Curator of Digital Art at the Victoria and Albert Museum. She is responsible for developing the museum's digital art collection. She co-curated the V&A display Patrick Prince Digital Art Visionary and has published numerous papers on generative art, early computer art in Latin America, gender art and technology, collecting and conserving digital art, and she's also the co-editor of the forthcoming V&A and Thames and Hudson publication, Digital Art 1960s to Now. Joining Melanie is Paul Cohen, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Pittsburgh and the representative of the Harold Cohen Trust. And Catherine Mason is an independent art historian and author who has been writing about the history of computer and digital art since 2002. Her books include A Computer in the Art Room, The Origins of British Computer Art's 1950 to 1980, and to be published next month, Creative Simulations, George Mallon and the Early Computer Art Society. She has also written for the forthcoming Bloomsbury Encyclopedia of New Media Art and writes regularly for Studio International and Tickle Arts magazines. She is also on the board of the Computer Art Society. Without further ado, please welcome our guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you to my fellow panel guests. We're going to have a discussion about Harold Cohen. And I first met Harold in 2003. I was very fortunate to visit him in his San Diego studio. And then we corresponded over the years, and we met when he occasionally came to London, and we would go out to lunch. And we often went to a little Indian restaurant around the back of Euston Station, where they had a set meal for $5.99. And he would say, "You're such a cheap date." And I was very pleased to call him a friend, as I'm sure many people in this room tonight would agree with me on that. So I think he would be very thrilled to know about this exhibition that he is showing both here in the heart of central London, the London Gallery District, and also at the Whitney in New York. He would probably ask why it has taken so long, but that would be another story. Well, Harold Cohen had a very long and productive career, and his work addressed many of the issues that we as humans are still grappling with today, including primarily artificial intelligence, but also questions of what is creativity? Can a machine be programmed to do some of the things that humans do when they make art? And what is our relationship to our tools? Cohen's art is one in which the process is very important. The Code of Aaron is a critical part of the art. It's integral. It is not just a means to an end. So indeed, we are ultimately talking about the nature of what it is to be human. Of course, at the end of the day, Harold Cohen also made really beautiful, colorful paintings. So we've got a lot of things that we can discuss tonight, but I want to start off with the premise which this exhibition that we're in here is actually about, which is the artist's transition from working with the medium of paint to the medium of code, to put it very basically. How did he get there, and perhaps why did he change his medium from an analog to a digital? And then towards the latter years of his career, he moved back into a combination of both, combining paint again onto underpainting provided by Aaron. So I'd like to start off with asking his son, Paul, really. Perhaps you can just briefly tell us about his early career here in the UK as a painter in London and how he got started. I think you said he was born in 1928, which is the same year that penicillin was invented.
That's right. That's right. And how long have you known Harold?
Well, since 2003.
So I've known him since 1955. No, Catherine asked me to say a bit about his work in London. And the truth is, I was like 11 years old, and I don't know that much about his work in London. I would go to his studio occasionally. But there are some recollections that I think might shine a little light on Harold in London and maybe why Harold left. The first thing I want to say is that if you look at this exhibition and you look at the work, there is clear continuity between the painting he was doing and the work he was doing with computers. And I think that's important because there is among some people the impression that when Harold started using computers, something horrible happened to him and he became a changed person and he was no longer Harold Cohen, the artist. He was some kind of geek, right? And that's simply not true. The issues that concerned him when he was painting in his studios in London carried over into his work with computers. Nothing ever changed. One thing that absolutely never changed was his concern for what he called evocation, or the ability of an image to make you think about stuff. He very much rejected the idea that a painting was telling you about what he had in mind. He would say a painting is a meaning generator, not a meaning communicator. Now, if you think that way, there is no better way to test that hypothesis than with a computer, right? Because if you can make a meaning generator that is not the artist, that's a strict test of the hypothesis. Right? And so one way to think about his computer work is a strict test of the hypothesis that certain kinds of marks will cause people to think of things. And the cleanest way to do that is not to make the marks yourself, right? But to write the code that makes the marks. That's why Catherine is right when she says Harold was very much concerned with process, only secondarily with appearance. Right? Interestingly, today's generative artists are largely concerned with appearance and very little concerned with process. So I grew up in a household where the business of making paintings was what was really preeminent, and that the paintings themselves should serve to cause people to think of stuff, to be evocative. And I think it was, they're marvelous paintings, and, to me it's no surprise that he was selected for the Venice Biennale, and he got to be a really pretty famous artist here in London. Now, it depends on whose story you believe about what caused him to leave for California. Harold's story is, I was bored. And there may be a bit of truth in that. Another story is, people were generally pissed off at Harold and he was pissed off at everybody else. And so the opportunity to go and spend a year in Southern California seemed like a good idea. Somewhere in there is the truth. Before we leave London, though, I want to tell you a couple of things that you might not know. We had a computer in 1966. It was made of plastic, and there were little bits and pieces that you could pull that would make a ball fall in a particular path. Harold was fascinated by this. Harold taught me to build a transistor radio. He was pretty good at electronics. Harold made me a recurve bow from maple and fiberglass, engineering the whole thing himself. Harold built his own darkroom. Harold had a machine shop. Harold was always an engineer, right? And so that's another thing that carries over. right? He didn't suddenly, turn into a different person. He was concerned with evocation, and he was a damn good engineer, right? And that sort of is the transition. It's no big surprise, frankly.
But it's interesting because various commentators I read someone who said, who wrote, he walked away from it all.
Yeah.
The irony really is that he didn't give up art. He swapped media and moved to a different climate.
Yeah. I mean, the only question is whether he left or he was kicked out, honestly.
But I think it's interesting. He's in his mid-40s at this point, isn't he? So, I mean, this is later than perhaps some of the other pioneers of computer art that we can think about, who maybe started, doing things younger. So when you're in your 40s, he already, he'd been working in art for a long time. He already knew what art should be. And his art was based in modernist European painting.
Well, whatever it was based in when he was a student at the Slade, I mean, that gave way pretty fast to a pretty distinctive set of issues. I find the stuff he was doing as a student completely unrecognizable.
Right. Right. But when he was in his 40s years of age, that's when so he's reached a median, is what I'm saying. So you talk about the boredom and perhaps he was bored, perhaps, he got kicked out or other people got jealous that London art world terribly small and incredibly backstabbing now, let alone then. She says, speaking from experience, perhaps, when he's reached that point, I'm just saying mid-40s sounds like a kind of an age when you might say, you know what, I'm going to do something.
Absolutely. And actually, anybody who knows Harold knows that he was really restless all the time. I mean, he worked till almost literally the day he died. I think the last couple of days of his life, he couldn't get in the studio, but the rest of the time, and when I say work, I don't mean rework, I mean invent new stuff, right? So the last thing he built, because he couldn't walk anymore, couldn't stand anymore, but he still wanted to be able to have control over color and the line, was he built this huge screen, and then he wrote the code so that he could finger paint on the screen. And he did that. He must have been 85 when he did that. And if he'd lived longer, he'd have done something else. He never stopped.
Never stopped.
Yeah.
Do you think that, just to jump in with the question though, that part of that critical reaction that the press and the art world, like when they referred to this like big radical shift from one medium to the other, perhaps also came from the fact that there just weren't that many, correct me if I'm wrong, artists who had initially trained as fine artists, as opposed to coming from a more, I mean, we've acknowledged that he was an engineer as well, but he did have a fine art training. There weren't that many artists who'd made that transition.
By that point.
Yeah,
which
so
we're talking we're talking like 67 here.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't alone. There definitely were other artists in this
68,
camp, but
sure.
do you think that's potentially why there was this critical reaction from the art press at that time? Because they didn't necessarily understand that transition.
I think that's very true. Very
Well,
true.
perhaps, but we did have cybernetic serendipity.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
it wasn't an unheard of idea, right?
And
No,
and
but it
cybernetic
wasn't
serendipity got a lot of press coverage because
Yeah.
people were so excited by the novelty of the undertaking.
That's,
Yeah.
yeah, but I still feel like in terms of art schools, like and how it was being taught and how it was,
agree.
like I think within a certain circle, absolutely it was accepted and like experimentation was coverage, but like in the broader thinking about museums and like the bigger infrastructure of the art world,
Yes,
I think that's
yeah.
where perhaps this misunderstanding arose.
And
from.
didn't the V&A acquire and commission some of his stuff when he was in this mode of, right back from the Venice Biennale, 1966, famous, doing
Yes,
paint?
absolutely. So in terms of when we first met, Harold and I met in 2010, but actually the first time I came across his work in a V&A context was work that the museum acquired much earlier on when they commissioned a tapestry off the back of the Venice Biennale. And so the first works in the museum are actually sketches and this tapestry that he created with Dovecot Studios. So it wasn't at all computer generated work, but there is now this nice synergy between the tapestry works that are held by the museum and later works that he created using code.
And that is not very well known, that practice with him doing textile design and working with textiles. I know very little about this at all. But you have written about this in the book, so people can read more about that. But give us a really quick overview of what it was that he did, because the V&A, he was very famous. We've got to point this out, very famous. So the V&A, big famous museum at the time, had money in those days, decided to commission him to do this work with dovecot.
Yes, so he'd already produced a piece for BP called Overall, and it was on the back of that the V&A then decided to commission. I think they the early catalogues describe it as like, I think it's still called like a hanging or a tapestry ? So today there's still lots of research still to be done.
Okay, it's interesting.
And it was, I think it's one of those pieces that there's a bit of information about it, but still like lots of work, still much more research to be done. But it was on the basis of his painting that the work was commissioned.
So someone felt that this painting would work well translated to tapestry.
It wasn't a painting.
It wasn't a painting. No.
Okay.
It was a design.
A design.
Yeah.
But they saw him as a painter, and they felt he will go into tapestry well. I mean, they saw a synergy between the two somehow.
Well, I think there was a bit of a leap of faith about how would the work be how would the design, he was commissioned to design something, and that design was then given to the Dovecot studio, but then he wrote really eloquently about his work with the studio and what it meant to like learn about a new process. And I think that taps in a bit to what you were talking about, Paul, like always looking to experiment and explore and to make and think about process. So I think it's a mindset, and I think that's reflected in those.
And he worked with weavers, and he wanted to be involved in the design process.
That's what he said.
And very much a collaborative mode. You wrote in the book, it's a further way in which he relinquished a degree of control over his creative autonomy, which we later see him picking up with Aaron.
Yes, I mean, it is kind of provocative. I intentionally wrote it that way, and we can pull apart whether we feel like that necessarily was the case. But I think that's an example of where one form of collaboration can be seen, and obviously he spoke about Aaron as being a collaborator, so it's how you interpret that word. He wasn't known, especially as being somebody who regularly took on collaborations, but I think it speaks to not being afraid to try something, even when it is a very difficult process. But these can be seen as examples where that was the case.
So this is around 1967.
Yep.
So just prior to that, maybe this is a good time for me to stick in my cybernetics, because there was a little known event that happened in 1963, and I think this has a bearing on some of what Harold later did, and I write about it in the books. You can read more about it in there. I've also written an article for Studio International about this, which is on their website. So Harold was working part-time at Ealing College of Art in around 1961, and many artists in those days, for those of you who don't know, did part-time jobs of teaching. It was very, very typical. 1 or 2 mornings a week, Now, it was here that Roy Ascott, an artist, came to teach his revolutionary course at Ealing called the Ground Course. Roy Ascott had studied with Richard Hamilton and Victor Passmore, and he had devised, inspired by cybernetics, a new type of art curriculum, which he called the Ground Course. And as I say, inspired by cybernetics, these were concepts that were then in the air at the time in scientific circles and were very soon to enter into art. And Roy Ascott was one of those early people who entered it into art. There were other people like Gustav Metzger working around this time too. So what exactly is cybernetics? For those of you who don't know, cybernetics is about, according to Norbert Wiener, the set of problems centered about communication, control, and statistical mechanics, whether in the machine or in living tissue. So cybernetic self-regulating mechanisms they're about communication, and they include communication within an observer and between the observer and the environment. So obviously they have a great relevance to arts. Okay, Roy Ascott brings in his good friend, Gordon Pask, who he'd recently met in 1963 to give a talk for the staff and the students in the college. And this becomes this famous lecture about cybernetics. Now, who was Gordon Pask? He was a British cybernetician. He was a real polymath. He named himself a mechanic philosopher. But most importantly, his theories drew on science, information theory, and experimental psychology and behavioralism and so on. But the most important thing to know about Pask is that he crucially made things. He made objects to explain his theories and to test his theories. So he made machines that demonstrated ideas. He made interactive artworks using feedback that made his art appear intelligent. And he came and gave this talk to the students and staff of Ealing about cybernetics. Now, Stephen Willits, this famous artist, was a student there at the time, and he called this a seminal moment of change. And Bernard Cohen, who was Harold's brother, still is, beg your pardon, recalled this lecture by Pask, and he asked a question. He said, "But Mr. Pask, you are trying to make us into machines." And Pask came back saying, "Yes, but you have infinite variety." So this was very profound for the students, certainly, there. And we know this from other students, in addition to Stephen Willits, who was there at the time. And the staff apparently went away, locked themselves in a studio, and did some discussion and experimental drawings, notational drawings, based on what they had heard from Pask. So I think that this is one of my hypotheses, that Cohen had these ideas in his head as early as 63, and then we hear about some process and some cooperation from around 67.
Yeah.
It's coalescing with some other things that we heard you describing, Paul, that maybe he was to do with the art world and his position in it and his feelings thereof. We then have cybernetic serendipity that comes along in 1968, to which he goes, and he sees Gordon Pask's Colloquy of Mobiles, which was displayed there. Now, the Colloquy of Mobiles, I'll just tell you very, very quickly, is a mobile, a sculptural work that was hanging from the ceiling, which was a self-organizing system of robots that communicated with each other. They learned and they evolved through simulating biological processes. So there were male robots and female robots, and they were trying to reach a state of homeostasis or equilibrium between the two.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Wouldn't that be nice? I think, Pask also was I never sadly met him. He was quite a tongue-in-cheek sort of character. So yes, there was some humor here. The audience could also interact with these robots by shining torches with them. Now, we do have the curator of cybernetic serendipity sitting right here in the front row, Yasha Reichardt, a great pioneer of exhibition design and curation. So maybe she could add something to that later on. But this was just before 68, just before he starts going. This was August 68, cybernetic serendipity, and he gets to the United States around about the autumn time, doesn't he, of that year? Paul, yes?
Yep.
So he then, well, perhaps you should tell us what happens then. He gets, he stops painting for a moment, and he becomes fascinated with a new way of using his brain.
I don't think he stopped painting.
Okay. For exhibition purposes, stop painting?
No.
Okay.
I mean, when he got to UCSD, he had a studio. I don't think he produced much, but after all, he thought he was only going to be there for a year. It was a visiting position, and he had lots of responsibilities, and I don't think that there was a lot of art made. What was made were connections with Ursula Blughi, Ed Klima, Roy Andrade, George Mandler, the entire founding of what today we call cognitive science.
Yes.
Right? So Don Norman, Dave Rummelhart in psychology. I was an undergraduate there at the time. And there was this sort of foment around the idea that you could use computers to understand how the mind works. And those were his friends. Those were the people he was talking to. And it was actually, it was sort of one of those magical moments in history where just the right people are in the same room, right? And I don't know what prompted him to start writing code, but it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, it's sort of the obvious thing to do, right? And he didn't have a computer, so he used the UCSD computer, which I did too, and I can tell you it was no fun. And then, I don't know, I think sort of early 70, maybe it's a bit later, I wish I knew, he got his first computer.
Okay.
And it was this thing, no one had ever seen such thing. It was called a mini computer. And it had 32K of memory, made by Data General. And you programmed it in BASIC. Now, just in case, just so that people have a sense of scale, 32,000 is 10 to the fourth, right? A single one of Harold's images had 10 to the sixth pixels, and that was a little image. So you're off by 100 before you even start, which means you need to think really hard about your algorithms.
Yeah.
And I think, how many of you here program? How many of you here write code?
Oh, we've got several.
Right, so you would probably agree with me that once you start, you can't stop, right? I mean, it's an entirely absorbing activity, and so that's how it went.
Yeah. And some of the early pieces, and this is before we get to Aaron, and there's one just around the corner there that you can see, made with Fortran or Ditran, which is a
Ditran, yeah.
Ditran, which is a
Actually,
subroutine of Fortran, or a,
no, it was
what do you call it?
No, I think Ditran was a dialect of Fortran.
Okay.
The reason I'm hesitating is that Ditran's a dialect of Fortran that was printed on a CalComp plotter, and I always get the two of them confused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is really, really interesting and important when we think about the transition from something like this, isn't it, to getting to Aaron?
Well, oddly enough, I mean, I think these were quite anomalous, and I think Harold was just fishing around at this point.
Yeah, they're very experimental.
Very experimental.
Yeah.
I don't think they have anything to do with his later work.
But I do, because it shows that he's got a sense of, he's thinking about how to code and how to write your algorithm to tell the computer what it is you want to do.
Yeah, but
And-
everyone does that.
Well, not everyone, not most artists don't do that. Maybe we've got some great pioneers. We have Ernest Edmonds in the front row here too. But this is an unusual thing. Yeah.
Well, we can disagree about this, but
I'm going to side with Catherine, because we have a couple of examples in the V&A as well,
They're
where
wonderful.
he's also in pencil on the same work, like written what the code is in order to create the works, and I think it's kind of an interesting insight both into how it's made and the fact that he's chosen I think, and they're presented as finished works.
And he
So it's
does, they're
intentional.
signed. Isn't that one, that long,
they're
important
signed,
shape of
and
sign,
there's
isn't it?
this work from this series as well as the codings.
no, that is absolutely true. And Harold wouldn't sign it if he didn't like it and if he didn't think it was legit.
Yeah.
He thought it was legit.
Sure.
It's just, it's a bit like an evolutionary branch, right? And he didn't go further down that branch.
Absolutely.
Right, he went
Absolutely.
that away.
But I think he had to see the branch. He had to look in the door, poke his head
Well,
in, shut the
we
door,
can
and go back
disagree
down the
about that.
corridor.
But yes,
If anyone is interested in the kind of algorithmic behind this, that the Aaron's Code book by, I never get her name right. Is it Patricia or Pamela McCord? Pamela McCord is got a description of this, which is well worth looking at, actually.
I will, however, before we leave
Yes.
Harold's really earliest work, I do want to say one thing, which
Okay.
is that I think people don't generally know this, but now imagine you're an artist and all your life you've been told you're a magnificent colorist, right? You, Harold, you're a colorist. You do color. And you get to California and you start working with computers. There are no CRT displays. There's no color displays. There's no way to color anything except by hand, which he did. So where are you going to start? And where he started was with what he called the freehand line algorithm. And that's very significant because every other artist who was working with computers at the time drew straight lines or mathematical curves. And Harold's view was a human would never read an image as an image if it didn't look like it was made by hand. The freehand line algorithm is so fundamental to Harold's work that if he had done nothing else, it would still be a major step. I spent 2 months deciphering the freehand line algorithm, and frankly, it is so smart that I've thought about patenting it. It's a very clever piece of code, and it served him for 40 years. He used that one algorithm for 40 years, and that's why the line looks like it does, and why every time you look at Harold's stuff, you say, I get it, I see it, I recognize it. It's the line you're recognizing, right? And it was a marvelous piece of work, and it came just very shortly after that.
Yeah, yeah. But to do that, he moved to Stanford. Is that correct?
No, Stanford.
Okay.
Stanford was 73 because
Okay,
I was there
okay.
during the summer.
Okay,
So no, it was a bit later.
a bit later.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. All right, so actually, I did find something that I wanted to mention about Frieder Naka. He told Frieder Naka in an interview that he was, and this is Harold speaking, Frieder Naka, a great German pioneer of generative art, graphics. He told Frieder that he was baffled but overwhelmed by the code elements that opened up in front of his eyes. And this, I thought, really follows Naka's premise of generative graphics, which is if think the work, don't make it. If you follow this sort of mantra that Naka has about thinking the work, don't making it, then there is not one work, but a multitude of possible realizations. Different schemata, different methods and techniques, all to generate works. In fact, an entire family of works come about, a thinking of infinities, as Frieder Naka calls it. And that ties in very nicely with what you described to us about the line. Because you can now do many, many iterations now that you have your line.
Yeah, and let me just add one thing to that, which is that the line has 42 variables, which is a lot when you only have 139 lines of code and you have to write in a language like BASIC. Of those 42 variables, 7 of them are adjustable parameters.
Okay.
If you adjust the parameters, you get those lines, or you get those lines that you were just showing us, or you get some of the lines you see in the back. It turns out those 7 parameters can be adjusted to give you just about any line you like, and he knew what he was doing, right?
This kind of thinking of infinities. I really like that idea. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so okay, now he also said in 2005, I can change the rules, but Aaron can't. Aaron is the rules.
Yep.
And I find that very interesting. But then, of course, later on, he changes that somewhat because he goes back and starts doing painting, either with his finger or with actual brushes in ink. Around 2010, he started using actual brushes.
Yeah, I mean, you're skipping over 30 years.
Okay, tell me some stuff in the middle. Let's talk more about Aaron before we go into talking about. I can change the rules, but Aaron can't.
Yeah.
He is the rules.
Yeah, all right. So by, I'd say, late 90s, he was thinking about machine learning. And he recognized that Aaron was not autonomous in an interesting sense.
Not interesting enough for him as an artist.
Well, I don't think interesting enough for anyone.
Okay.
So autonomy is we could spend the next 2 days talking about autonomy,
Yes.
but I mean, any given generation of Harold's programs is instantaneously recognizable. You would never confuse one generation for another. There's a strong family resemblance, and thus there's, and also you can't get from one to the other without Harold.
Yeah.
Right, so it's not like it would be wrong to think that, despite all of this talk about collaboration, it would be wrong to think that Aaron is thinking up anything,
No.
right? It just isn't, right? It's an extraordinarily sophisticated way of making images that have not been seen before, have not been imagined before. to be more autonomous, Aaron would have to learn. To learn, you would need some form of feedback. Aaron could not see. Aaron could not hear. I mean, there was no easy way to get feedback. For a brief time, he and I talked about machine learning for Aaron. Whether it was his impatience or my pomposity, I don't know, but that did not end well.
Okay.
So, if Harold had lived longer, and if he had thought that he had invented it himself, he would have eventually come to machine learning.
Okay.
Yeah. That was the inevitable trajectory, and he knew it.
So can you tell us how Aaron then differs from today's commercial big tech
Yes.
AI generators, which
Yes.
are all of the rage, and any cursory glance at social media, you'll see hundreds, millions, billions of examples. So people think that's AI when it relates to art, but with Harold Cohen's practice, it's extremely different from that, isn't it?
Yes. Now, I can't really answer the question with authority because I don't know everything that's being done today. But what I can say is that, I'm reasonably familiar with GANs and neural networks, and I've worked in AI for a while. A neural network is a piece of code that has billions of parameters, and learning entails adjusting those parameter values. And you need, as I said, some feedback in order to do learning. And the feedback that is commonly given is some notion of what an image should look like.
So in other words, here's the tree of the trunk of the tree, and the branch goes off at this angle.
No, I mean something more like, I want Lady Godiva with wings, right? That kind of thing.
In the style of Vincent van Gogh.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd forgotten that part. No, so I'm sort of parodying it, and I'm sure there's a great deal of work that's much more sophisticated than that, but the distinction I'm trying to make, and that actually Harold made, and that even if he hadn't made it, it's sort of obvious when you look at his code and when you look at his history, it's the distinction between the process of making the thing and what it looks like. And for Harold, what it looks like was always a byproduct of the process of making it. And I think for a lot of generative art, it's what it looks like. Right? Because how it's made is you adjust a billion parameters until it looks like what it's supposed to look like.
Yes.
Right? Completely different.
Completely different, because it's almost like, how do you tell a machine to encode my drawings and what I know about art, what he knew about art, into it? He tried to put every single thing that he knew about art that he'd gathered in 40-odd years into the machine.
Well, maybe. I haven't seen all the code. I mean, the code I have seen, he must have a pretty tiny mind, because there wasn't that much in it. But there were principles. I mean, the principle of feedback, that the next mark depends on what's available, right? The way you fill space depends on how much space is available, was constant throughout his work. The idea that first you figure out what's inside and then you draw around that, right? The idea that you never erase.
Oh, okay.
Ever, right? He never erased as an artist. Now, if you're not going to erase, you have to worry about occlusion. And if you're making a machine handle occlusion, now, of course, today with game engines and so on, it's sort of a piece of cake, but think back to the 60s, right? You have to develop algorithms that will draw things in the right order.
And depth and so on, you're talking about perspective and kind of sense of depth?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the early work didn't have a sense of depth, but it did have occlusion.
Right.
Right? One thing was in
on top
front of another,
Yeah.
right?
And you could tell that thing was behind.
Well, not only could you tell that it was behind, it was that was one of the strategies for making something look like it meant something, right? So I told you half the story. I said Harold wanted to make evocative images, right? Images that would create the sense of something, that would create the sense of meaningfulness. What I didn't tell you is that But I did tell you about the cognitive science stuff. So you put those two ideas together, and here's what Harold ended up with. Our perceptual systems provide us with universal strategies for perceiving the world. If you're going to read an image, you're going to be capitalizing on those strategies. So it would be crazy to make images in which there was not occlusion, in which there was not a baseline, in which there was not light coming from a direction, right? Because these are all very, very common strategies, not only for artists, but that's what our brain is responding to. So he thought, well, fine. If I could figure out what people's brains are responding to, and if I could encode that,
Yes.
right? So it's not so much his knowledge of a painter,
Okay.
it's his knowledge about what people are,
Of how people
how
perceive
people,
art.
yeah.
How to see, really.
Yeah.
I've found another lovely quote, which I'll just mention because we have got Ernest Edmonds in the front row. And this is from Ernest's interview in 2009. And Harold said, "I think an essential element in art practice is an ongoing dialogue about the nature of art. And you conduct that dialogue partly through your work, partly through conversation, partly through reading. So visual representation is founded in human cognitive structures."
Yeah.
And that's really fundamentally what he was trying to do. How do we see? What do we see? Why do we see it? Why do we respond to something that's attractive or not attractive? Or
Yeah, so that picture there that's on the screen right now, he was without a computer briefly in 1973. This was during the Watergate hearings, and I was up there at that time, and I was helping him build a plotter. Those pictures there are made by Harold, and the way he made them was he got Dacron sailcloth, which is very, very stiff cloth. He crumpled it up, spread it out, and then he spent a lot of time thinking about which edges to ink and which edges not to ink.
okay,
Right? What he's looking for is the strategies for making marks that will be meaningful.
yes.
Right? And he spent the whole summer doing that. And actually, these are some of my favorite things.
So they're pretty much analog in that sense.
They are absolutely analog.
Fabulous,
Well, actually, all of Harold's work is analog in a sense.
in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to play devil's advocate.
Yes,
here
please,
and,
Melanie.
perhaps take issue, well, that's a broad stroke brush, but I think there are certain younger, well, maybe not necessarily generative artists who maybe associate with the term generative artists who aren't entirely just purely thinking about what it looks like, but are interested in
In
the process. And train data sets on their own drawings or their own works. So I think it's, I'm going to perhaps take issue with the idea that all generative art that there is a big difference between, for lots of it, that is very much the trace, but I think for certain artists that's not. And I think the increased interest in his practice is driven by, this renewed interest in his work, certainly as somebody in the museum who works in the Princeton During Studies Room, where we have many artists' work, but we have an increased request to see his work by students who are in art schools, as well as collectors, and many, many folk. And I think this is driven by a renewed understanding of the significance of, but also the connection to contemporary practices.
Yes, yeah.
She's-
And people are rediscovering pioneers at the moment, which is very good news. In fact, we could say that digital art is having a huge moment. Which is interesting because previously it had no moment at all. And Harold used to tell me, how on earth can I get a London gallery? And now I'm sitting here in a London gallery. So it's, it's very exciting. from
Although
that point of
maybe
view.
that's also a good time to sort of bring in the idea of, and this has perhaps always been the case, this question about what words, which terminology do we use to describe this type of work. As we know, Harold wasn't a fan of the term computer art, which was in the past used to describe some of this practice. So I think, we still need to think carefully about how we describe it or situate the work.
And maybe there will be a day when we don't use terminology, we just talk about art. But the process does seem to be important, and the tools and the techniques that are used also seem to be important here. So I think that's why we discuss that with this. Yeah.
I'm really, really happy to be corrected. I mean,
It's just an idea. I'd love to throw it open to the audience. I'm sure there's
We probably have some artists here.
I'm
who want to hear from you.
I mean, I'm very happy to hear that there are artists working in AI today who are genuinely interested in process. And it's got to come. So I do some work with language models and so on, and I was delighted to learn just last weekend that OpenAI has developed LLM-based theorem prover. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but a theorem prover is all about process. And so it was very good for me. It was really good to see that you could use a neural network to control a process. So I'm glad to hear that that's happening. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about conservation, and is restoration coming into it yet, Melanie, at the museum? I know that there's issues with this type of work because even though you think, well, 1969 is not that long ago, some of this paper was fugitive, it was computer paper, it wasn't designed to last, etc. So what kind of issues are you having to address in the museum with regards to that?
Yeah, so certainly conservation is something that we think about, and I will throw this back to you as well, because obviously I know the work that you've done in recreating, well, would you say reconstructing, yeah, and I think even thinking about what terms we use to think about how we reconstruct works, and it's something that we think really seriously about when acquiring work, in terms of like what remains, what was the intention behind the work, especially some pieces that are performative, and often what's left, that we're left with, becomes the work. And I think this is something that there was lots of notes, or some notes certainly, in the case of Harold's work, what was left behind, which helps us to understand how pieces were made, but often there's not as well. So we think really carefully about certainly historical works, but also contemporary works. What will happen to these works in the future when we don't have the artist to go back to really understand like how works were made? I think it's something increasingly there are courses, because digital art conservators, there's a desperate need, I feel, for them, and increasingly this is being addressed, but it's still, in London anyway, a kind of a small pool of people with this particular skill set. But yeah, digital art preservation throws lots of challenges. It's still very much something that we're figuring out as an institution, but I feel like that's very true of the whole museum sector.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, we were talking today about trying to convene a small conference on this topic, and the reason is that, and here I'm just reflecting on my experience since Harold died, there's so much I don't know, and I don't even know who to ask, right? And there must be lots and lots of people who are saying, well, I have these floppy disks, who do I talk to?
Yes.
Or, you know, I can't really place this thing in time, who's the expert? Or, yeah, it's just, I think there are probably, you know, roughly a dozen kinds of expertise you need if you're really going to be serious about the preservation of digital art. And you know it much better than I do, but it's a huge spectrum of effort.
I think with Howard's work is particularly pertinent because he famously talked about his work posthumously. We were in a conversation.
Are we going there?
Yeah, we are going there very briefly, because I feel like it's a question that might be thrown up by the audience. But I don't know. Do you want to talk about the triangle very briefly?
Sure. Yeah. So you know, so Harold got himself into trouble, and now he's gotten the rest of us into trouble by claiming that he would be the first artist in history. Remember, this is Harold. I will be the first artist in history to have a posthumous exhibition of new work. Now that's just wrong.
Okay, tell us why. Tell us why. Because
it's wrong from the get-go.
For the person who doesn't know, you might be able to set the code running, and you know, the next morning you could come back and you could see what it had produced.
Yeah, what it had produced would be just like what it produced last night.
Okay.
No, so it's wrong for a number of reasons. One is it hinges on the word new, and we've already talked about that. Aaron never did anything new. Harold made new versions of Aaron.
Yeah.
So it's wrong from that standpoint. But I think an interesting analysis of it, because we knew we had to get ahead of this thing, right? I mean, people were going to, and indeed people do, quote this.
Didn't he actually retract it, though, at some point? He
Not
sort
to
of
my
went back.
knowledge.
Oh, no,
If you
okay.
can find it, let
Okay,
me know.
all right. Okay, we need to ask Ernest about this later. Okay.
No, I mean, if I can find a deathbed confession, I will use it.
All right, okay. But it was a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing.
I believe it was.
Yeah.
So we were trying to figure out how we're going to get in front of this thing. And actually, it was my daughter speaking with George. Where's George? The three of us were sitting upstairs trying to figure out what are we going to write for the press. And Allegra came up with the following analysis. Think about a triangle: the artist, the process, and the art. Now, remove the artist and keep only part of the process. Is the stuff that comes out the artist's art? Hell no.
No. Yeah.
So what was missing? So Harold set all those parameters. Harold made the new versions of Aaron. Harold often painted or colored the images themselves. Harold built the plotters. Right? If you go look at the machines, if you go look at the drawings that are made by the plotters, look at the line. Right? That line is partly algorithmic and it's partly mechanical jitter. Right? Harold liked that. You know, so don't tell me that Aaron was doing all the work. Aaron wasn't doing half of the work. So now I'm going to remove Harold. I'm going to remove all the work he did. I'm going to run a bit of code and call it a Harold Cohen? I don't think so. Now we go one step further. Paul Cohen takes the code, right, and rewrites it in Python.
Okay.
That's not a Harold Cohen.
No.
And then we go one step further. There is no code for Paul to rewrite. So Paul goes to the notebooks and Paul figures out what Harold must have done. Is that a Harold Cohen? Hell no.
Absolutely not. No.
Right?
Okay.
So, you know, I think this whole thing is, I think the whole idea is just way too simplistic. And the problem with it is that it does not acknowledge that Harold was an artist who made art, right? And it's all rah-rah about the turtle or the plotter or the computer, and that's just totally missing the point.
Yeah. Well, I think at one
Do
point.
okay?
Yeah.
I think at one point he had an exhibition, was it in Amsterdam at the Stedelijk, and there was the turtle,
Stedelijk.
and there were people were looking at the turtle, like, oh, this
yeah.
clever little turtle's drawing stuff.
this happened
and they
last-
were focusing on that instead of on the actual artwork.
So the Whitney show is made possible by the donation of a wonderful collection that Bob Handel collected over the years.
Okay.
And so the Whitney said, well, we've got all of these great Harold Cohens, let's have a Harold Cohen show.
Right.
And by the way, why don't we have some plotters there? Now Bob comes to the opening and everyone's looking at the plotters.
Yeah.
And Bob's going like, well, why'd I give you these paintings? Right? I mean, no one's looking at the paintings. So Harold really got annoyed. And that kind of...
That was quite early on, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't. Well, sorry, at the Stedelijk it was.
Yeah.
But he just got more and more annoyed. And by 1995, he started to reduce Aaron's responsibilities pretty significantly.
Okay.
He went from mechanical device to large format printer that he
Yes.
could control much more
Yes.
carefully. So he basically took back control in the last.
And that kind of gave a gap for him to then start putting his own color and his own.
Well, he
paint
always
on.
did that.
Yeah.
He always did that, but I mean, one of the things he did was he would have Aaron make colored images and then he'd overpaint them,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
just to assert his authority.
But that goes back to kind of a studio atelier Renaissance style, the artist, where you make a cartoon, you make a drawing underneath, and then you use that.
I suppose so.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, a sort of craft based, going back to the Renaissance.
Well, he knew that stuff. He could grind his
Of
own
course he could.
paint.
Yeah, of course he could.
Yeah.
Should we open it up to the
Yeah.
audience? Does anyone have any comments or questions that you'd like to ask, or any observations on what you've heard? Please, Ernest, tell us something
Okay.
interesting.
Just a couple of anecdotes
Yes.
that may be relevant. One is about this transformation about which this exhibition centers on.
I'm going to give you a mic, Ernest.
Okay, so two anecdotes. One is about the transformation that we see around here. Both these anecdotes are just things that Harold said to me, right? So about this transformation, the interesting thing that he said to me was that he went into the code, into writing code, because he was unhappy about his progress as a painter. He wasn't making progress, and he
Yes.
wanted to understand it more.
Yes.
And I think that's something that we've not discussed, but is an important thing, that the writing of the code, in his view, was helping him understand more about what he was doing and progress what he was doing.
And
Right.
what it was to make
So,
art.
so the process, which Paul was talking about, the process was really critical, and the writing of the code was positive. Was a positive contribution to that process as an artist, to understand better what he was doing and to move forward. So it wasn't about making objects. It wasn't about painting. It was about that process. And the second point is about colour. He said to me much later that he'd struggled with colour a lot. He'd used all kinds of physical models of colour in his code and whatnot, and none of them worked, basically, at all. And then he woke up, he said to me, I quote more or less exactly, I woke up one morning and I thought, hey, I used to teach colour to people at the Slade. Why did I write a code that describes what I taught those students? Not the physics of the code, but the rules of painting colour.
Okay.
And then he said, oh, the only problem was that the code seemed to produce even better colour than I was producing myself.
Okay. Well, that
Of course, he then went on to do this stuff where he used he interacted with it. But anyway, there are two anecdotes that might be.
they're wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else? There's someone back there.
I have a question that's like maybe slightly more psychoanalytical. Being an American in England and in the art world, a lot of artists are like self-proclaimed like cynical. And I'm very curious of like this transition to America, specifically what would become Silicon Valley. The tech, back then, even my professors at Stanford was like, there's an optimism here that doesn't exist anywhere else. In this really happy-go-lucky spirit that you find very much out there in California. And I was wondering if that had much of an impact of coming from like this world here in London out there. That's not necessarily like process-based, but more like how did that impact a psyche of an artist? Also, like a lot of people, just because you speak English, think it's the same culture, but it is very much a culture shock going to Northern California and even LA to the south.
What do you think, Paul?
I think it's a wonderful question, and
It
I
is a
wish
wonderful
I could say something authoritative about it. I mean, I know what you mean, right?
Yeah.
There's, especially if we're talking Southern California and the sun is shining. And remember, in the years before he left, Southern California, the surfing culture, the Woody's cars, right, the race cars, all of that stuff. Dick Hamilton had explored that space. Pop art was really very much about what was going on in California. And so I don't know whether when he got to California, he was disappointed or thrilled. But you're right, the sun shines every day. It's a big university. There are great possibilities. It's very, very beautiful all the time. He has great colleagues. And then he built a really fine art department. I mean, it was one, I think still is, a preeminent art department, and he was instrumental in building that. So I'm guessing that, you know, the first 15 years or so, he was pretty much on top of the world. That's my guess.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's a great question.
It is a great question. Yeah. He also got married again. So yeah, I think he was probably a very happy man.
That's really nice to know.
Yeah.
Hi, hello everyone. So maybe I have a question more to Melanie, because I'm very interested. What are your opinions on Digital Design Weekend in Victoria and Albert, and maybe how AI art actually had developed it, and if there are many more artists that are focused on artificial intelligence that are taking part in Digital Design Weekend, which is in September. And also, since Victoria and Albert is a museum focused on like history of manufacturing and arts and crafts, I'm very curious how you are balancing the history of the museum and development, like technological development in art and AI, and all about we are talking today here. So yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay. So the Digital Design Weekend, for anyone not familiar with, happens every second to last weekend in September. And just very quickly, the history of that program is that it actually developed out of an exhibition that happened in 2008, 2009 called Decode Digital Design Sensation Now. And the learning department realized that they weren't really offering any engagement specifically with the digital community. So they organized a series of workshops and events, and then it was decided that that should actually grow into a larger offering, really, that continued to engage with digital artists and designers and practitioners and audience who wanted to continue that after the exhibition, because the exhibition's like had a run of maybe 4 or 5 months, then went on tour. But the digital program stayed in acknowledgement that this was like a new, well, not new, obviously, goes back to the late 60s and before, but new venture for the museum, certainly at any rate. And then the Digital Design Weekend evolved as a part of that. In terms of working with AI artists, I used to program and work on the Design Weekend. I no longer have that role, but work very closely with Mark Bartow, who was the senior producer who produces it. And yeah, AI has kind of infiltrated the museum in multiple different ways, sometimes through interventions at the Digital Design Weekend. But if you think back to like 2018, a former colleague, Irini Papadimitri, curated a show called Artificially Intelligent that also like spoke to what does it mean for artists to engage with AI. And so AI kind of, we think about it, and also like much more recently required The Economist, the issue with text to image, like generated image on the front cover, the first one that they produced. It kind of enters a discussion in multiple ways. So it is through the Digital Design Weekend, but it's also through objects that we acquire, but it's also through various events and programs, an invitation for artists to explore what these works mean. Little promo here, but we are recently about to produce a book, or a book to be published, which touches on some of the issues that we think about, of course, are very relevant, thinking about Harold Cohen, and to acknowledge that these aren't necessarily always new ideas. Some of the questions that are being asked about AI today, how it's being addressed is different, but the underlying questioning of what does it mean and how the different ways that artists and maybe creative practitioners, to be slightly more inclusive, think about it is something I think that goes across the board. So yes, it is something that we think about in terms of the Digital Design Weekend, but it's not just limited to that. I mean, yes, if you look really closely, there's some like beautiful tiles in the V&A that like have the S and the A intertwined in them, and they were like they were put there when the museum was first built, and they kind of stand for the science and the arts and where they mix together. So the science collection actually went across the road to the Natural History Museum, and the art collection stayed in the museum. But some of the ideas are absolutely integral, and I think when it comes to AI and art, you can't actually, well, it's like natural history, no, sorry, the Science Museum does have some material and we have some material, but I think it's a wonderful example of where actually it's quite hard to distinguish between the two. I'm not sure it entirely answers your question, but that's a brief overview of like the Digital Design Weekend and AI.
And the museum holds really important collections now of historic computer art, for which is a term we're going to use from the 60s, which are based in the Patrick Prince collection and the Computer Art Society collection and a lot of donations. So there's a big history that goes back to that as well.
Yeah.
This goes to you.
Yeah.
Following on that, I put an exhibition together at the Royal Society of Sculptors just before Christmas called Interplay. And one of the exhibits there was from students of Central St Martin's, and they'd worked with Google Mind and created a violin that was an AI kind of program that played a duet with the human player. So they created a kind of jazz situation between the AI and the person. I just wonder how that plays in your conceptualization of authenticity of an output of a piece of work. Just a comment, really. Just
yeah, the interaction between, like, where to start. I don't. Catherine, I'm going to throw this to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. You said to me it was music, and it was sort of like a jam session or like an improv section with jazz, which has got that kind of tradition of lots of different people coming together and just sort of inventing it at the time, improvising. And so maybe you improvise with an artificial intelligence. That's kind of interesting. It's really interesting.
It's great in cybernetic terms. What was being done was never done before. It was random, complex, and happening there and then between the two. But it was happening, and the people recorded it.
Yeah. Was it good? I mean, was it fun to listen to? Was it good?
Well,
Not for you, oh dear.
who was the authentic artist there? Was it George Miller, or could you say the human, or
Presumably the violin, which was hooked up to an AI thing, was getting inputs from what the human did and then adjusting itself and then putting it back out?
They're both doing the same.
Okay.
The human was responding to the AI, and the AI was responding to the human.
Okay.
So you have that jazz improvisation.
Yeah, I think that's very cool.
But I think the question of randomness is something like, when you talk about it being new, and it sounds like something different, but randomness itself is something that many people have thought about, and what do we mean by random, and how truly random is it, is a question where I think where we can see this, questions that have been explored in the past and continue to have a relevance to artists today. So there is like continuity.
And it reminds me when you described, Paul, about the heavy sailcloth crumpled up, placed down, that is a random technique.
Yes, but the choice of which lines
Yes.
to ink was not a random technique. And actually, for what it's worth, randomness plays almost no role in Harold's work.
Okay.
And now, that's not to say that you can't find calls to a random function, but two things are true. One is there are many fewer than you would expect, and the other is that, for random, Harold meant something in the range of 3 degrees to -3 degrees, right? So that, yes, that's random, but it is highly constrained, right? How space gets divided, sure, there's some random component to that, but it is very heavily constrained. And I think, generally speaking, remember, we're cognitive, perceptual objects, we all are. We evolved to see structure. Randomness is anathema. There's nothing interesting or attractive about randomness. There's nothing about randomness that makes you think of anything except by chance. Now, that brings me to another reflection on your violin playing, your duet playing program. Harold had a very clear idea of what he was trying to accomplish and a very clear idea of what winning meant. He knew what success looked like. And one of the things that he told me is that it is not enough for the machine to make an image. So it is not enough for the machine to make images when only 1 in 10 is good. Right? Randomness had very little role, because that's what happens when you fall in love with randomness. You end up with a bunch of images, most of which are no good. He wanted every image to be good, and he wanted 10% of them to be extraordinary. And that he actually accomplished, and he did it. I mean, it was a very purposeful activity. And that's really why he did not rely on randomness.
Can I
Very
support that by saying that goes back to the point I made that he said to me about the code helping him understand how to make art.
Yeah,
And that's exactly this point that you just made.
yeah, exactly. So I think, you know, for any evaluation of Harold, you have to ask, did he accomplish what he set out to accomplish? Right? And so now let's think about your violin example. What are they trying to do? What's the question? I mean, I don't care whether it's good or bad. What are they trying to do? Right?
I don't know, but it's called hybrid resonance, if you want to Google people. I think they would I'm anticipating they would try and steer the human would try and steer the AI.
Uh-huh.
Whether the AI is going to try and steer the human
Yeah.
is a question. But it was a linked project.
No, I think you're right. And so let's use that to explore another of Harold's goals. And he often said that the machine is a collaborator. Ernest said that. You know, he was fond of saying that, but we have to ask, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
And what that means for Harold is that the machine and working with the machine helps him figure out what the next step is, right? What the next generation looks like. And so if that's what your violin person was doing, all power to them. If they were simply thinking, wouldn't it be cool if a human has a duet with a violin? I'm sorry, no. Right? This isn't about cool. Right? Yeah.
Hi, yeah, great talk. Thank you. I'm curious, towards the end of his life, did Harold have any kind of unfinished sort of dreams for Aaron? And did he feel that, you know, or had he felt that he'd kind of maxed out Aaron's kind of potential? I'm kind of curious. The reason I ask it is because if you look at the history, you know, he was teaching the program first, the freehand line algorithm, to draw, and then to kind of mazes and portraits and plants. And then as we kind of seen it started becoming more abstract towards the end. But I was curious, was that sort of something that he was happy with, or did he feel that there was more that he had yet uncovered that he couldn't have time to do because of his own mortality?
I honestly don't know, Robert. I really don't. I mean, you could never tell with Harold because he never stopped. I know he regretted not moving into machine learning. I think he would have liked to have done that. But remember, he also stripped Aaron of much of its autonomy. So I don't really know. I do think that if you look at, you know, the sort of first 20 years ending up 20 years. Anyway, I always sort of think of it as a triangle again. It starts in 68. 95 is the painting machine. That's Aaron at its most autonomous. After that, Aaron never had that kind of autonomy, right? And it was more and more about Harold. One way to tell the story is that, you know, Harold was himself a pretty good artist. Now, having demonstrated that a machine could make pretty good art, I think he wanted to get back to making art. I could be wrong. So, you know, I think he was probably pretty content in the last couple of years of his life with the work he was making.
Like tack onto that question then. I don't know how anecdotal this was or totally like not accurate at all, but I think I read somewhere that one of the reasons why it was called Aaron was because, like, in reference to his name, but also the A, starting with the letter A and then potentially like moving on. But of course there was no B, no C, no D. So ambitions at the beginning versus ambitions towards the end will have differed, presumably. Like what he thought was going to happen, what he wanted to achieve, where he ended up were two different places. Like what he might have thought he was going to move forward with wasn't actually the case. He did spend 40 years with Aaron when there were no other, there were different iterations of that, of his work with Aaron, but it didn't necessarily transpire that there was like, I don't know, whatever it was going to be called, with a B.
So,
Was that anecdote, like, is there any truth in this story, or
oh,
is
the
that...
bit about the A and the B?
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
apparently that's true.
Okay.
Some things never changed. The focus on evocation, on meaning generators rather than meaning communicators, the passion about color, those things never ever changed. What changed was his relationship with the machine and how the machine was helping him. That's really it. I think that's all I got. I mean, he was very, very consistent in the issues that drove him. But he changed sort of frequently in how those were manifest. Now, back to Robert's question and this point about the early years, things changed real fast in the early years, and they did slow down, right? So by the time you get to 1995, the discoveries are fewer and fewer, right? And that may also have something to do with him sort of taking back control. I think he might have felt that Aaron was sort of tapped out by 95. I'm not sure, but it's not an impossible idea. Yeah.
Interesting.
He did change the line algorithm, though. In 2012, he changed, that one algorithm that had served him all that time, he replaced it. So I think he was looking for something new. Yeah.
I can't claim to be an expert in this at all. Was he looking for surprises all the way through his process? Was he looking at each stage to bring surprises to him?
So Harold's, I have two answers to that. One is that if you look at the work that Harold printed, it was always sort of a quirky version, and he really liked that a lot. So the second answer is that he wrote the code in such a way as to ensure surprises. Now, one way to do that, and really I only know the very early code intimately. I don't know so much about the later code. One way to do that is to have more parameters than you need. Think about a 15-speed bicycle, right? You have how many combinations of gears if you have 3 front gears and 5 back gears, right? Some of them feel the same. Some of them feel completely different. And some of them are just downright pathological. The more parameters you have, the more degrees of freedom you have. And I'm not talking about randomness. I'm talking about choices. The more choices you have, the greater the opportunity to be surprised. So he over-engineered the code with parameters. I said there were 42 variables, way more than was necessary. And I think he did that to ensure he would be surprised.
It's interesting. Thank you. It's interesting. How are we doing? Anybody else? No? One more? Time for one.
I think Alina might will be fine. Quick one from Melanie, actually. You mentioned this aspect of generative AI, or at least generative artists that are concerned with the process. I would actually love to ask you to do more about that. Okay, so great. So, question is about how do people can combine surprises and the topic that was just brought up now, which to me also means some level of randomness, with process.
Not necessarily. You don't necessarily need
so you can
random
have a
to get
planned
surprise.
surprise. It's like, I know my birthday is coming up in a few months. I don't know what I'll get, but it's a planned surprise. Like, I don't know. Just curious to get some examples and your Melanie's thinking on this.
I don't know. I mean, I see part of my role as a curator is to kind of take in what lots of the different ways in which artists are working, and for me, where do I find that interested is when perhaps, as kind of was explained before, it's not just necessarily about the outcome, but they're working either sometimes with their own data sets, or they're asking the question of why are they doing it and how are they doing it and not necessarily fetishizing about the technology that makes it possible. And I think questioning as they go, like these are, I mean, everyone does it in such different ways. And I mean, that's one of the delights of being a curator, of being able to like go around and talk to different people about why they're doing what they're doing and how they're doing it, rather than any one prescriptive, this is the sole thing that I find interesting. I think there are a lot of, I guess what people have, artists have access to today is much greater than, is it? Yes, like in terms of the technology has moved on, but have the concepts and the ideas, yes and no. Yeah, I don't have a simple, quick answer to that question, I'm afraid. I don't know, do you have any further thoughts on?
Only the relationship between randomness and surprise. There is a mathematical version of that, and that's Shannon's theory of information. And actually, he called the log of the probability of an event, he called the surprisal of the event. That leads to very uninteresting kinds of surprise. Think about a joke. A lot of humor is based on surprise. There's absolutely nothing random about it. A joke is a very carefully constructed artifact, right? And it relies on surprise to make you laugh. I think most kinds of surprise are the result of the interactions of things. So in the case of a joke, the surprise is an interaction between your expectations and the punchline. Right? It's the interaction of things that causes you to go, oh my goodness. Right? It's not randomness at all. It's the construction of a machine that will interact in interesting ways. And certainly that was how Harold felt about it. Feedback is a big part of that. Right? So if it just so happened that the program got itself into a pickle and all the actions happening over there, right? That's not random. It's because of the way space is being divided up, and there might be one or two little random components to it, but that's the one Harold's going to print. Yeah. And the relationship, the randomness that caused that to happen is just the tiniest part of it. Right? It has to do with, well, I'm using this space, I'm doing something over there with this space, like, I mean, look over here, right? Mm-hmm. There's nothing random about the distribution of things in this painting, right? But the reason that block is over there is because those blocks are over there, right? It's all about interactions of things, not randomness. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be pedantic about it, but the mathematical notion of surprise based on randomness produces essentially nonsense. And that was one of Shannon's earliest discoveries, because Shannon used to put letters together randomly. And what he discovered was that when you put letters together randomly, respecting the probability of those letters appearing in text, you get things that look like words but aren't. And that's when it started to get interesting. So it's not the randomness, it's the structure, it's the probabilistic structure of things that really makes it interesting. Anyway, sorry. Nope.
There we go. Very good.
I think that's a very good explanation of that. I think that's really clear.
Again, the random speed and then you combine with the structure.
No, that's exactly right. And I couldn't have said it better. Thank you. That's a good way to say it. Yeah. You know, actually, you just helped me think of something, which is the repetition part of it. And I think it reflects back on the process versus appearance thing. If Harold had been driven by appearance, he would have changed Aaron a lot more often than he did.
Yeah.
Right? Because he'd have gotten bored. They all look sort of roughly the same.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't think it was about appearance. I think it was about process. And he wanted to see over and over and over again what that process would produce. Yeah. No, it's very good. I think your point about repetition is spot on. I hadn't really thought that it was sort of a necessary part of what he was doing. And I think it is. Thank you. Yeah.
Excellent.
I think we're done. I think we're going to finish there.
All right, thank you all.
I thank my panel very much, and thank you to the study for hosting.